Once again, the queen consort surprises us, but not in a good way. She had made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia. The order did not arrive with a ceremony, a speech, or even a warning. It came behind closed doors, carrying consequences powerful enough to fracture the royal household in minutes. Prince William had made a decision few inside the palace believed he would ever dare make. Camilla's royal standing was being revoked, and her son was being permanently denied palace access. But the most explosive detail was not the punishment itself. It was why William believed he had no choice. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William entered the private Windsor meeting carrying a sealed directive while senior aides waited in uneasy silence. Routine engagements had already been delayed. Phones had been kept outside, and Charles was nowhere in the room. That absence mattered. The directive, a formal written instruction used to communicate an official household decision, was not being presented as a suggestion. William placed it before the senior officials and stated that the decision took effect immediately. Camilla's elevated royal standing would be withdrawn within this dramatized account, while Tom Parker Bowles would be permanently barred from private palace residences and restricted royal areas. William did not look victorious. He signed the final page, kept his hand near the pen for several seconds, then pushed it away, as though touching it any longer would make the consequences heavier. The future king understood exactly what he had done. Moving against Camilla meant confronting his father's marriage, disturbing wounds tied to Diana that had never completely disappeared, and risking a break with Charles that no carefully written palace statement could repair. Yet he also believed allowing the situation to continue would carry an even greater cost. Camilla received the message privately from a senior aide. She read the first lines without speaking, then stopped when she reached the signature. "William signed this himself?" she asked. The aide confirmed it. Her expression hardened immediately. The queen consort had survived criticism from outside the royal household for years. But this was different. The challenge had come from inside the family, from the man expected one day to inherit the crown, and the humiliation cut deeper because she knew the order was already moving through official channels. Tom's name appeared separately. William had ordered that he could no longer enter designated palace spaces without direct authorization from the highest level of the royal household. The wording stunned those who saw it, because it suggested something larger than family tension. According to a fictional documented palace account, William had recently been shown a confidential file detailing repeated access requests, interference in household arrangements, and an attempt to influence privileges normally reserved for working royals, family members carrying official duties on behalf of the monarch. Charles learned what had happened only after the directive had begun circulating internally. He read the summary once, then again before asking an aide whether his son was still at Windsor. When told yes, the king ordered an immediate private meeting. His voice remained controlled, but the people around him recognized the anger underneath it. William had signed the order. Camilla had received it, and Tom had been shut outside the gates. But before Charles could demand an explanation, the deeper question had to be answered. How had three people bound together by family reached a point where a palace door could become an act of war? Long before the order carried William's signature, the real battle had already been living quietly inside the family. Charles saw Camilla as the woman who had survived decades of hostility beside him. William saw something far more complicated: his father's wife, a senior royal figure, and an unavoidable reminder of pain his childhood never completely escaped. Now Tom's involvement had turned an old emotional fault line into a direct challenge over trust, access, and the future of the crown. William had spent years forcing himself to separate memory from duty. Diana's death had left wounds that no royal ceremony could erase. Yet the prince understood that the monarchy could not be governed by childhood grief. A working royal, a family member carrying official duties on behalf of the monarch, holds responsibilities that private relatives do not. That difference mattered, because Camilla had built an official place beside Charles, while Tom Parker Bowles remained a private family member who still moved close to royal spaces without carrying the same obligations. Charles read the summary of William's directive alone. His eyes moved slowly across the page before he placed it flat on the table and told the waiting aide to leave. The king did not see only a household order. He saw his son reaching directly into the most personal part of his life. Camilla had stood beside him through years of public hostility, and now his heir had effectively declared that loyalty to her could no longer protect everyone connected to her. William felt the danger just as sharply. Before meeting his father, he admitted during a fictional recorded private conversation with a trusted household advisor that personal affection could not be allowed to decide who received privileged access. He had watched the monarchy suffer when family relationships became tangled with authority before. Yet he knew Charles might hear those words differently. What William called institutional protection could sound to his father like a judgment on every painful decision that had shaped their family. Camilla began asking questions of her own. In a private conversation documented within this dramatized account, she asked whether Catherine had seen the confidential material before William signed the order. The queen consort had noticed the princess expressing quiet concern about palace boundaries in recent weeks, and she became convinced those concerns had strengthened William's resolve. Catherine had made no public accusation, but Camilla now wondered how much influence had been exercised behind closed doors. Tom reacted with anger rather than shame. During a private telephone call with his mother, he demanded to know exactly what evidence justified naming him in such a severe restriction. He argued that a permanent ban made him appear guilty of something far greater than a disagreement over access. Camilla tried to calm him, but his frustration only deepened when she admitted she had not been shown the complete file. Then one memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. Weeks earlier, Tom had appeared in a restricted area of Windsor after being explicitly told not to enter. William had seen him there himself. Several witnesses later identified that brief encounter as the moment the prince's patience finally broke. The ban looked sudden from the outside, but inside the family, everyone knew there had been a point of no return, and it had begun with one closed door at Windsor that Tom was never supposed to walk through. The incident lasted less than 10 minutes, but afterward, almost everyone involved remembered the silence. It happened during a private Windsor gathering when the public rooms had emptied, and only family members, senior aides, and a handful of authorized staff remained. Tom had already been told one corridor was restricted, yet moments later, William saw him emerging from precisely that direction, and beside him stood a palace official carrying something the prince believed Tom had no right to discuss. William stopped walking the instant he recognized him. The restricted family corridor was being used for conversations about future household arrangements, private schedules, and decisions connected to the next reign. A working royal, someone carrying official duties on behalf of the monarch, could be included in those discussions. But Tom Parker Bowles held no such role. That was why his presence mattered. He was not simply visiting family. He had entered a part of Windsor where private influence could easily become institutional advantage. William approached him quietly and asked why he had been there. Tom answered that he had been invited to speak with a household official, but the future king pressed further. Who had authorized it? Tom hesitated. That pause changed the mood immediately. He insisted the conversation was harmless. Yet he refused to name the person who had arranged it, and William's suspicion hardened into something far more serious. Camilla arrived after hearing the tension in their voices. She moved directly between her son and William and told the prince that Tom was family, not an intruder. William did not raise his voice. He simply answered that family and official authority were not the same thing. The queen consort went still. She understood the meaning at once. He was no longer arguing about a corridor. He was drawing a boundary around the future crown. Tom tried again to defend himself, but the explanation only created more questions. A fictional documented internal account prepared after the gathering later stated that the palace official had been approached about preserving certain private privileges and residence access after William assumed greater authority. No promise was recorded, but the request itself alarmed the prince. To him, someone was already trying to secure influence before the transition had even happened. Anne made the danger impossible to ignore. In a private conversation recorded in the dramatized household account, Princess Anne warned William that exceptions made for relatives could become precedents others would demand later. She told him that once unofficial access started shaping official decisions, reversing it would be far harder than stopping it now. William listened, because the princess had no personal stake in the argument. Her concern was the institution itself. Then the final detail surfaced. Days later, William received a second internal note, showing that Camilla had known Tom intended to speak with the official before the Windsor gathering. The information did not prove a conspiracy, but it changed the entire emotional weight of the incident. What had looked like one man's reckless decision now appeared connected to a much wider attempt to protect future access. The corridor incident had given William a reason to investigate. But learning that Camilla may have known about the meeting changed everything, because the next conversation would force him to accuse his father's wife to her face. There were no secretaries in the room, no courtiers to soften the language, and no prepared statements to hide behind. William waited until the door had closed before placing the Windsor access record on the table between them. Camilla immediately understood what the meeting was about. What she did not expect was the question that followed. William did not ask whether Tom had entered the restricted corridor. He asked whether she had helped arrange the meeting that brought him there. William kept his voice controlled as he laid out the three concerns one by one. Tom had entered a restricted area. He had discussed future privileges with a household official, and Camilla had known the conversation was going to happen. The access record, an internal palace log showing who was permitted into protected areas, gave the prince a clear timeline. He told her this was not about a son visiting his mother. It was about whether private family access had begun crossing into official royal authority. Camilla's anger came quickly. She asked whether William truly believed she would work against him or weaken the future monarchy for Tom's benefit. The queen consort had expected questions, perhaps even criticism, but not an accusation that touched her loyalty to the institution itself. Her voice hardened, then softened, when she realized the prince had already decided a boundary had been crossed. For her, that was the deeper wound. He was not asking what happened anymore. He was judging what it meant. William refused to let the conversation drift toward Diana. He knew how easily old pain could swallow every argument between them, and he would not allow this decision to be dismissed as revenge. The future king told Camilla that private affection could never become unofficial power. If relatives were allowed to secure access simply because challenging them felt uncomfortable, then the rules protecting the monarchy would eventually mean nothing. He admitted the decision would hurt Charles. He also admitted that knowledge had kept him awake. Camilla finally gave him the answer he had been waiting for. In a fictional recorded account of the private exchange, she acknowledged knowing Tom wanted reassurance about whether his access would change when William gained greater control. She insisted she believed he was asking a personal question about remaining close to his mother. She denied trying to manipulate future arrangements. William listened without interrupting, but then he opened another part of the file. William showed her two earlier requests. One concerned Tom's access to a private royal gathering. Another involved seating arrangements after staff had already explained that formal approval was required. Neither incident alone was explosive. Together they formed a pattern. Camilla stared at the record and understood that William had been quietly tracking these interventions for months. Camilla left the room shaken and went directly to Charles. She told the king that William was preparing to formalize restrictions against both her and Tom. Charles listened, his anger rising with every sentence. Within the hour, he summoned his son. Camilla had defended herself. William had refused to retreat. And now the conflict reached the one person capable of turning a family fracture into a constitutional crisis. Charles was waiting for his son. Charles did not begin by asking about protocol. He began with one sentence: "You have humiliated my wife." William remained standing for several seconds before taking the chair opposite him. Between them sat the order, the same pages that had already changed Camilla's position and closed palace doors to her son. The king wanted the decision reversed. The prince had arrived prepared to explain why, for perhaps the first time in their lives, he was ready to refuse his father completely. Charles leaned forward and demanded to know whether the restriction was temporary or permanent. William answered without hesitation. Tom's ban would remain in every part of the royal household controlled by his future authority. That authority, the power attached to William's growing responsibility for appointments, access, and planning tied to the next reign, did not make him sovereign, but it gave his decision real force. Charles still held the crown. Yet his son was already shaping the structure he would one day inherit. Charles took the answer personally. He reminded William that Camilla had endured decades of hostility and had spent years proving her loyalty beside him. To the king, stripping away her standing did not feel like neutral administration. It felt like punishment. He accused his son of dragging old wounds into the present, of letting Diana's memory influence a decision that now threatened his marriage. William did not rise to the accusation. He told Charles that blaming the past would actually be easier than facing the present. Trust had been damaged now. The future king said he could not inherit an institution where private relationships were allowed to bypass rules simply because enforcing those rules became painful. He understood what the decision cost his father, but he refused to pretend affection could erase a boundary once it had been crossed. Anne strengthened that position later in a private discussion. Princess Anne confirmed, through a fictional documented household account, that she had already warned senior staff against granting informal access to relatives without proper approval. She told Charles the problem was larger than Tom himself. If one exception was accepted because someone was family, another would follow, then another. William's argument was no longer standing alone. Charles's anger shifted when another detail surfaced. A senior aide admitted that an earlier written warning concerning Tom's access had never reached the king, because the official believed the matter could be handled quietly. The monarch read the warning in silence, and realized he had been shielded from information that might have changed everything weeks earlier. His frustration did not disappear, but it moved away from William. Charles finally stopped demanding an immediate reversal. He offered no public support, no warm agreement, and no apology, but the order remained untouched. Camilla understood his silence as something close to abandonment. While Tom received a direct message confirming that his next planned palace visit had been cancelled, Charles had entered the room determined to overturn his son's decision and left without doing it. When Tom learned the gates would remain closed, the first true consequences began. Tom discovered the ban was real when his name disappeared from an access list. There was no dramatic escort, no confrontation at the gates, no public spectacle. A scheduled visit simply ceased to exist. His driver received new instructions. Palace security received an updated authorization sheet. And inside Clarence's house, Camilla sat with the message in her hand. For the first time since William signed the order, its meaning became brutally physical. Her son could no longer simply enter the world she occupied. Tom called her almost immediately. Palace security protocols, the internal rules deciding who may enter protected royal areas and under what authority, had already been changed, while future private invitations involving him were quietly removed from schedules. He asked Camilla whether Charles would step in. She paused long enough for him to understand the answer before she finally said the king had not reversed anything. Tom's anger collapsed into disbelief. He had expected resistance from William. He had not expected silence from the man he believed might still protect him. Camilla felt the consequences closing around her as well. Staff began changing internal arrangements connected to future ceremonial appearances, and her standing inside this fictional royal structure was reduced in ways that could no longer be dismissed as symbolic. She went directly to Charles and asked why he had allowed the directive to survive. The Queen Consort told him that neutrality was still a choice when her family was being pushed away. The king answered that he was trying to protect his marriage without damaging the institution he had sworn to serve. Neither found comfort in the explanation. Then the household officer at the center of the Windsor meeting gave a recorded internal account. The dismissed official stated that Tom had wanted reassurance about whether his palace access would continue after William assumed greater authority. No promise had been made, the officer insisted, and no formal privilege had been granted, but the account confirmed something far more damaging. Camilla had known the conversation was planned. That single detail made the earlier denials harder to defend. William, however, had already chosen restraint. According to a fictional documented account later reviewed by Anne, advisors had proposed a harsher response that would have exposed the entire internal dispute and named the access concerns publicly. The prince rejected it. Princess Anne understood what that meant. He wanted the boundary enforced, but he was still trying to shield Charles from a humiliation that could have consumed the whole family. Charles recognized the same truth before the day ended. Official meetings, written warnings, and formal arguments were only driving father and son further apart. He sent William a personal message asking him to come alone. No Camilla, no aides, no papers, no household officials, just the two of them. The gates had closed on Tom, and Camilla's anger had hardened. But beneath the institutional battle remained something simpler and more painful, a father and son who had not spoken honestly to each other in years. For once, there was nothing on the table between them. No directive, no access records, no advisors. Charles had deliberately stripped the meeting of everything that allowed them to speak as monarch and heir rather than father and son. William arrived expecting another argument. Instead, the king admitted something neither man had been willing to say aloud. Protecting Camilla from every humiliation had sometimes made him reluctant to see when protection had become permission. Charles spoke slowly, without the sharpness that had defined their previous confrontation. He accepted that Tom should never have been involved in discussions about future royal access without clear authorization. Future royal access meant the permissions and privileges that could continue or change when William eventually assumed greater authority. Even if Tom's concern had begun as a family question, the king now understood that bringing it into official household planning had crossed a line. William listened without interrupting, because this was the acknowledgement he had been waiting for. Charles then admitted what had made him resist so fiercely. Years of watching Camilla face public anger had trained him to defend her almost instinctively. Every criticism felt familiar. Every challenge sounded like another attempt to punish her for the past. The monarch confessed that this instinct had made it harder to judge the present clearly. William finally saw that his father's anger had not been driven only by authority. Guilt, loyalty, and fear had been sitting beneath it all. William's own restraint began to break. He told Charles that signing the order had not felt like victory. The prince hated knowing that the decision would wound his father, and he feared that protecting the future crown could become meaningless if the process destroyed the family carrying it. But he also said, Unresolved boundary violations could destroy both. If rules disappeared whenever enforcement became painful, trust inside the monarchy would disappear with them. Charles made the concession that changed everything. Tom's permanent restriction would remain. The king would not override his son, and he would not create a private exception later. For the first time, William knew the argument over palace access was truly finished. Charles had chosen to accept the boundary. Even though the emotional cost was severe, Charles went further. He told William he would not force him to restore Camilla's altered status either. The queen consort would have to accept consequences for involving herself in discussions surrounding her son's future access. The king did not say this without pain. He knew the decision would reach his marriage, but he also knew reversing it now would make every earlier warning meaningless. Then another problem arrived. Advisors informed them that cancelled invitations, changed schedules, and new access instructions were becoming impossible to hide. People outside the family had started noticing. Father and son finally found common ground, but reconciliation inside the palace could not contain what was already spreading beyond its walls. By morning, Britain would wake to the story. By sunrise, the private punishment had become a national spectacle. Phones lit up, broadcasters abandoned ordinary schedules, and reporters gathered outside royal residences, searching for confirmation. Yet one image captured the mood more powerfully than any statement. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd stood beneath the gates, while a newspaper vendor held up a front page dominated by 5 enormous words. William draws the final line. What began inside a Windsor corridor had become a public judgment on family, privilege, and royal power. Broadcasters treated the fictional crisis as the most serious internal royal rupture of William's generation. Commentators focused on the extraordinary combination of Camilla's reduced standing and Tom's permanent exclusion from restricted royal spaces. Buckingham Palace, the monarch's main official headquarters in London, released only a brief acknowledgement that internal household arrangements had changed. The statement offered no detailed denial, and that silence only made the story feel larger. People understood that something serious had happened because the palace was refusing to explain exactly how serious it was. Camilla sat with the morning papers and read the headlines one by one. She folded the first newspaper, pushed it away, then reached for another. Despite already knowing what it would say, advisors suggested a public response. Perhaps a carefully controlled statement defending her intentions. The queen consort refused. She knew that an emotional defense could make the humiliation worse, and she would not give the public another reason to believe the family was fighting through the media. William watched the coverage with Catherine nearby. The prince heard commentators praise him for drawing a hard boundary, but there was no satisfaction in his reaction. He told the princess that he wished responsibility had never demanded this price. Protecting the institution had meant publicly hurting Charles, and that victory felt hollow. Catherine listened quietly as William admitted that strength inside the monarchy could sometimes look exactly like cruelty to the people closest to you. Then one moment captured the entire national mood. A broadcaster reporting live from Buckingham Palace described the crowd as unusually silent rather than excited. Behind the reporter, someone held a handwritten sign reading, "The Crown Before Connections." According to this dramatized broadcast account, the image was replayed repeatedly throughout the day because it reduced the entire crisis to one brutal choice: family loyalty or royal duty. Charles offered no rescue. Palace representatives were asked whether the king opposed William's action, but they issued no correction and no statement distancing the monarch from his son. That refusal to publicly contradict the prince effectively confirmed that their private confrontation had ended. William's decision would stand. Charles made one final move before the day closed. He asked Camilla to meet him alone. She already knew Tom's ban would remain. What she did not know was whether the marriage itself could survive the cost of accepting it. The country had chosen its interpretation. William had accepted the cost, and Charles had allowed the decision to stand. But the true verdict would come not from television studios or palace gates, but from the final conversation between husband and wife. Camilla did not ask Charles to fight William again. That battle was already over. When the two sat together privately, the anger that had filled the previous days had been replaced by something heavier: acceptance. Tom would remain outside restricted palace life. William's decision would stand, and Charles, after spending years trying to protect the woman beside him from the consequences of royal history, finally faced a truth he could no longer soften. Love could not erase the boundaries demanded by the crown. Charles gave her the final answer without leaving room for another appeal. Tom's palace restriction would remain permanent, and he would not order William to restore the measures affecting Camilla's standing. The crown, the institution of monarchy and the authority attached to it, could not bend every time family loyalty collided with official boundaries. The king made clear that there would be no hidden compromise once the headlines faded. Camilla listened in silence, knowing this was no longer a temporary punishment. It was the new reality. Camilla finally acknowledged what had gone wrong. She still believed the response had been severe, but she accepted that allowing Tom to become involved in discussions about future access had created an appearance William could not simply ignore. The Queen Consort told Charles that losing status was painful, but watching her son become the symbol of a struggle he had never fully understood hurt more. The monarch took her hand, yet he did not promise that everything would return to the way it had been. Both understood that some consequences could not be reversed without reopening the entire conflict. William met his father again later, and this time there was no argument. The prince did not apologize for enforcing the boundary, but he did apologize for the pain the decision had caused Charles. The king accepted that distinction. He understood that his son was not asking forgiveness for protecting what he believed was right. William was asking whether their relationship could survive the cost of doing it. Charles answered by allowing the matter to end there. Tom reached the same conclusion during a final private telephone conversation with Camilla. In this dramatized account, he told his mother he would stop challenging the restriction. He understood that continuing the fight would only isolate her further and turn an already damaging family dispute into permanent warfare. Camilla accepted his decision with sadness rather than relief. William's action ultimately became about something larger than defeating Camilla or excluding Tom. It established one painful principle: closeness to the royal family could not automatically become institutional privilege. Charles sacrificed his instinct to protect his wife from every consequence. Camilla lost influence and access for her son. William preserved the authority he believed the future monarchy required, while carrying the knowledge that doing so had wounded his father. And with that acceptance, the doors remained closed. The order remained signed, and the argument finally ended, not because the family escaped the damage, but because William, Charles, Camilla, and Tom all understood that there would be no reversal. The crown had drawn its line, and this time everyone would have to live on the side of it they had chosen. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video. This dramatized account of palace tensions and family conflict illustrates how institutions and personal relationships can collide when boundaries are tested. The story of William, Charles, Camilla, and Tom reveals the complex balance between duty and affection that defines royal life. The decisions made behind those palace doors demonstrate that even in the most protected corridors of power, the fundamental struggles of families, trust, loyalty, and the cost of enforcing rules remain universal. Whether the crown can bend without breaking, whether love can coexist with authority, and whether duty must always triumph over devotion, are questions that extend far beyond the fictional walls of Windsor. As this dramatized narrative concludes, It serves as a reminder that power without compassion becomes tyranny, and compassion without boundaries becomes chaos. The royal family, like all families, must navigate the treacherous terrain between protecting those we love and protecting the institutions we serve. The gates remained closed, the order stood, and life, as it always does, continued. The kingdom moved forward, bearing the weight of choices made in private rooms that would echo through public perception for years to come. Thank you for following this dramatized account of palace intrigue, family conflict, and the impossible choices that leaders must sometimes make. We hope you found this exploration of duty, loyalty, and institutional responsibility compelling. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next dramatic narrative analysis.